There is something quietly extraordinary about the human mind, and the most remarkable thing about it is not how complex it is, not how many billions of neurons fire every second to keep you breathing and thinking and dreaming all at once, but rather how easily it can be aimed. Like a lens catching sunlight, the mind, when pointed in the right direction, can set an entire life on fire. And that is exactly what Earl Nightingale spent decades trying to tell people, in a time when nobody was really talking about this stuff, in a time when success was considered something that happened to lucky people or talented people or people born into the right families. He stood up and said, no, that is not how it works. He said the mind is the thing, the thinking is the thing, and if you change what happens inside your head, everything outside your head changes with it. Now, this is not a story about positive thinking in the shallow bumper sticker sense. This is not about repeating affirmations in a mirror or pretending problems do not exist. Earl Nightingale was far too practical for that. He was a man who grew up with almost nothing, who lost his father young, who lived in a tent as a boy because there was no money for a proper house, and who still somehow ended up becoming one of the most listened to voices in the history of personal development. His ideas came from real life, from real struggle, from real observation of what actually separates people who thrive from people who merely survive. And what he found, what he kept coming back to again and again across decades of writing and speaking and studying, was surprisingly simple. He found that your attitude, your mental posture toward life, is almost entirely responsible for the results you get from it. And that is where this journey begins. Not with a list of tips or a checklist of habits, but with a real understanding of what attitude actually is, what optimism actually does, and why the way you see the world ends up being, in almost every meaningful sense, the world you actually live in. Let us start with something Nightingale observed very early in his career, something that confused him at first and then fascinated him, and then became the cornerstone of everything he taught. He noticed that two people could start in almost identical circumstances, same town, same education, same opportunities, same economic background, and end up in completely different places 20 years later. One would be thriving, energetic, grateful, and building something meaningful. The other would be bitter, stuck, convinced that life had treated them unfairly. And the external differences between their starting points were almost negligible. What was dramatically different was internal. It was the story each person was telling themselves about who they were and what was possible. This is where the power of attitude becomes undeniable. Attitude is not a feeling you have when things go well. It is not a mood that rises and falls with your circumstances. Attitude, in the sense Nightingale meant it, is something much more foundational. It is the lens through which every experience gets filtered. It is the default interpretation your brain reaches for when something unexpected happens. It is the baseline assumption you carry about whether the world is working for you or against you, whether you are capable or limited, whether effort leads somewhere meaningful or disappears into nothing. And here is what makes this so important, so urgently worth understanding. That lens, that filter, that default interpretation, it is not fixed. It is not assigned to you at birth like your eye color or your blood type. It is developed. It is chosen, often unconsciously, through years of habit and repetition and the accumulated weight of what you have been taught to believe. But because it was developed, it can also be changed. That is the whole point. That is the entire premise behind everything Nightingale wrote. The lens can be cleaned, the filter can be replaced, the default can be reset, and when it is, life responds differently. Not because the external world magically transforms, but because you start seeing options you could not see before, you start taking actions you would not have taken before, and you start showing up in relationships and opportunities in a way that genuinely attracts different results. Now let us talk about what optimism actually is, because Nightingale was very careful about this. He did not mean the kind of optimism that looks at a burning house and says, well, at least the view is nice. He meant something much more active, much more grounded. He meant the deep earned conviction that problems are solvable, that setbacks are temporary, and that the effort you put in today is connected to something meaningful tomorrow. He meant the refusal to interpret difficulty as evidence of personal inadequacy. He meant the ability to stay curious and engaged even when things are not going the way you planned. He sometimes described it this way. He said that a pessimist looks at the world and sees it as it is and decides there is nothing to be done. An optimist looks at the world and sees it as it could be and decides to help it get there. And the optimist, not because they are naive, but because they are engaged, actually moves the world. The pessimist stands still and watches. The optimist walks forward, makes mistakes, adjusts, and eventually arrives somewhere worth being. Think about the people you know who seem to consistently do well across a variety of circumstances. Not people who never face problems because nobody gets that deal, but people who seem to recover quickly, who seem to find something useful in every situation, who seem to generate energy rather than consume it. If you think about those people honestly, what you will almost certainly find is that they share a particular quality of attention. They pay attention to what is working before they pay attention to what is not. They pay attention to what they can do before they despair over what they cannot. This is not an accident of personality. This is a trained habit of mind, and it is available to everyone willing to practice it. Nightingale spent a great deal of time studying what he called the strangest secret, and if you are familiar with his work at all, you have probably heard this phrase. The strangest secret, as he articulated it, is simply this: we become what we think about most of the time. It sounds almost too simple when you first hear it. It sounds like something you might read on a coffee mug and then forget by the time you finish your morning coffee. But sit with it for a moment. Let it actually land. Think about the implications of it if it is true, and the evidence for it, drawn from psychology, from neuroscience, from the practical outcomes of thousands of lives, is genuinely compelling. If you spend most of your mental time thinking about what could go wrong, you will unconsciously start organizing your behavior around prevention, around defense, around the management of threat. Your attention will be calibrated to detect danger, to notice obstacles, to find reasons why something might not work, and your actions, shaped by that attention, will reflect all of that caution and contraction. You will hold back, you will hesitate, you will find reasons not to start things, not to risk things, not to commit fully to anything. And the results of that kind of living, predictably, will confirm everything your pessimistic outlook expected. Conversely, if you spend most of your mental time focused on what you are building, what you want to create, what possibilities are present in the situation you are in right now, your attention will start calibrating differently. You will start noticing opportunities that were always there but invisible to you before. You will start generating ideas. You will start taking small actions that compound over time. And the results, not magically but mechanically, will begin to shift. Not because the world is fair or because positive thinking is magic, but because your engagement with the world has genuinely changed, and engagement changes outcomes. This is why Nightingale insisted so consistently that the quality of your thinking is not a secondary concern, not a nice-to-have alongside more practical skills. It is the primary variable. Everything else, your habits, your relationships, your work ethic, your skill development, everything else flows downstream from the quality and direction of your habitual thinking. Now let us take this into something more concrete, something you can actually feel in your own life. Think about a goal you have, something you genuinely want, something that matters to you. Now notice what happens when you bring that goal to mind. What is the first thought that follows? For a lot of people, the first thought is some version of, but I cannot do that because. And then a list of reasons arrives. I do not have enough money. I do not have enough time. I do not have the right connections, the right education, the right circumstances. I am too old. I am too young. I have already tried and it did not work. I am not the kind of person who does things like that. That cascade of reasoning feels rational. It feels responsible even. But what Nightingale would say, and what a great deal of subsequent research supports, is that those thoughts are not objective assessments of reality. They are habits of mind dressed up in the clothing of logic. They are your brain doing what it has been trained to do, which is protect you from the discomfort of uncertainty by convincing you that the uncertain thing is not worth attempting. The mind is extraordinarily good at this. It can construct an airtight case for inaction. It can find real evidence, actual data points from your actual life, to support the conclusion that you should stay where you are. And this is why merely hearing about the power of positive thinking is never enough. Because your brain can also hear those words and immediately generate a list of reasons why they do not apply to your specific situation. What actually works, what Nightingale found through years of observation, is something more disciplined and more honest than simple positive thinking. It is the practice of questioning your default interpretations. It is the habit of asking when you catch yourself generating reasons why something cannot be done, whether those reasons are facts or whether they are assumptions dressed as facts. It is the willingness to hold the question open a little longer than feels comfortable, to say I do not yet know how instead of I know it cannot be done. That shift, from I cannot to I do not yet know how, might seem small, but functionally, cognitively, behaviorally, it is enormous. I cannot closes the door. I do not yet know how keeps it open. And open doors are where ideas come from. They are where solutions arrive. They are where the path forward begins to reveal itself, not all at once, not in a blinding flash of clarity, but step by step, the way a road reveals itself through fog as you move forward through it. There is a story Nightingale loved to tell, or at least a version of it that captures the kind of thinking he was always encouraging. It involves two young men who grew up in the same neighborhood, came from similar families, had similar educations and similar starting opportunities. One of them, from very early on, developed the habit of looking at successful people and thinking, I wonder how they did that. He was curious about success rather than resentful of it. He spent time around people who were doing interesting things, asked them questions, absorbed what they said, and started applying it in small ways. He made mistakes, learned from them, made more mistakes, kept going. By the time he was 40, he was doing work he loved, earning well, and spending his time on things that mattered to him. The other young man developed a different habit. When he saw successful people, his first thought was, they must have gotten lucky, or they must have had connections I did not have, or it is easy for them because they had advantages I was never given. And that interpretation, repeated often enough, became a complete worldview. It became a story about the world that felt absolutely true to him, backed up by years of evidence he had unconsciously selected to support it. By the time he was 40, he was still waiting for his luck to change, still explaining his circumstances in terms of what other people had done or not done for him, still trapped in a narrative that left him with almost no agency. The external circumstances of these two men had not been dramatically different at the starting line. The internal circumstances, the stories they told, the questions they asked, the meaning they made of difficulty, those were completely different. And those internal differences, compounded over 20 years of daily living, produced outcomes that looked nothing alike. This is not a story meant to produce guilt or self-criticism, by the way. It is not meant to suggest that everything in your life is entirely your fault, or that circumstances and systemic realities do not matter, because they absolutely do matter. But it is meant to highlight the degree to which your interpretation of your circumstances, your narrative about why things are the way they are, has enormous practical power over what you do next. And what you do next is really the only thing you can actually control. Nightingale was fond of quoting and paraphrasing the ancient Stoic philosophers Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus especially, because they had been saying something similar for nearly 2,000 years. The core idea is simple enough. The world outside you is largely outside your control. What is inside your control, completely and always, is how you respond to it, how you interpret it, what you decide it means, what action you take in light of it. That domain of response is entirely yours, and it is astonishing how few people actually treat it that way. Most people, when things go wrong, spend enormous amounts of energy on the question of why things went wrong and who is responsible for them going wrong. Those are not useless questions, but they are not the most powerful questions available. The most powerful question, the one that actually leads somewhere, is simply, given where things are right now, what is the best next step I can take? Not the best step in an ideal world, not the step I would take if circumstances were different, but the best actual step available to me in the actual situation I am actually in. That question, asked honestly and answered honestly, nearly always reveals an action. And action, even imperfect action, even action that has to be adjusted and revised, is how momentum is built. And momentum is everything. Momentum is what turns a hard thing into a possible thing and a possible thing into an accomplished thing. The trouble is, pessimism kills momentum before it ever gets started. Pessimism mistakes the difficulty of the first step for evidence that the journey cannot be made. Let us move now into something Nightingale wrote about with great passion, which is the idea of purpose. Because he understood that optimism without direction is just a pleasant mood. Optimism connected to a clear, meaningful goal becomes something else entirely. It becomes the engine of a life. He observed, throughout his years of research and teaching, that the happiest and most effective people he encountered were almost universally people who knew what they were working toward. Not in a vague, I want to be successful kind of way, but in a specific, concrete, this is what I am building and why kind of way. They had taken the time to think carefully about what they actually valued, what kind of contribution they wanted to make, what kind of life felt meaningful to them personally, and then they had made that vision the organizing principle of their daily decisions. This matters because direction transforms effort. When you know where you are going, difficulty becomes information rather than discouragement. An obstacle is not evidence that you should stop. It is a puzzle to be solved on the way to somewhere worth being. When you do not know where you are going, every obstacle is potentially a reason to turn back, because there is no compelling reason to keep going forward. Nightingale often challenged people to do something that most of them had never done, which was to sit down quietly, without distraction, and write out in complete sentences what they most wanted their life to look like in 5 or 10 years. Not a wish list of possessions, though there is nothing wrong with wanting financial security, but a genuine description of the life they would find most meaningful and fulfilling. What work would they be doing? What relationships would be present? What would they be learning? What would they be contributing? What would a great day feel like? Most people found this exercise harder than expected, because we live in such a reactive culture, so oriented toward responding to what comes at us, that the practice of actually deciding what we want and writing it down feels almost presumptuous. Who am I to decide? What if I choose wrong? What if I work toward something for years and it turns out not to be what I actually wanted? But here is what Nightingale knew, and what the science of motivation consistently confirms: having a direction, even an imperfect one, is vastly better than having none. Because with a direction, you can course correct. You can try something, discover new information about yourself and what matters to you, and refine your aim. Without a direction, there is nothing to correct toward. You simply drift, carried by circumstances and other people's agendas, and arrive in places you never chose. He described this with an analogy he used often. A ship without a destination will be pushed around by every wind and current that happens along. But a ship with a clear destination, even if it cannot sail a straight line to get there, even if it has to tack and adjust and sometimes seem to go sideways, will eventually arrive. The navigation is different. The experience of the journey is different. The captain of a ship with a destination is engaged, alert, making decisions, alive to what is happening around them in relation to where they are going. The captain of a ship without a destination is just managing the vessel, keeping it afloat, going nowhere in particular. Your goals are your destination, and choosing them, articulating them, writing them down, and revisiting them regularly is one of the most genuinely powerful things you can do for your own life. Not because of some mystical law of attraction, but because goals direct attention, and attention, as we have already established, shapes the world you actually experience. Now here is something subtle but crucial that Nightingale kept returning to, something that separates the merely motivated from the genuinely effective. He talked about the difference between being busy and being productive, between activity and achievement, between motion and progress. Because one of the strange side effects of optimism, when it is not disciplined, is that it can generate a lot of enthusiastic action that does not actually add up to much. You can work very hard on things that do not matter very much and feel good about how busy you are. The energy is real, the results are not. What Nightingale advocated was something more deliberate. He called it working smart, which has become such a cliché that it has almost lost its meaning, but he meant something specific by it. He meant identifying the handful of actions that genuinely move the needle toward your most important goal, and prioritizing those above everything else. Not because everything else is unimportant, but because time and energy are finite, and what you choose to spend them on is, in practice, everything. He often pointed out that most people spend the majority of their working hours on things that feel urgent, but are not actually important, and very little time on things that are genuinely important, but do not feel urgent. The urgent things create pressure and demand your attention. The important things wait quietly and patiently for you to get around to them. And if you are not deliberate about this, if you are not consciously prioritizing importance over urgency, you will spend entire years being very busy and making very little progress on what actually matters to you. This is a form of pessimism, actually, even if it does not feel like it. Filling your days with urgent but unimportant activity is a way of avoiding the discomfort of engaging with your most important work. Because the most important work is usually the hardest. It usually involves genuine uncertainty and the possibility of failure. And the urgent stuff, the emails, the minor tasks, the low-stakes requests, those feel manageable. They feel safe. You can complete them and feel like you accomplished something. But at the end of the day, the week, the year, you look back and find that you have not actually built anything that matters to you. Optimism, real optimism, requires the courage to engage with the hard stuff. It requires believing that the difficulty is worth facing, that the discomfort of growth is preferable to the comfort of stagnation, that the fear of failure is a smaller cost than the certainty of regret. And it requires making that choice not once in a moment of inspiration, but over and over again, in the ordinary moments of ordinary days when no one is watching and nothing dramatic is happening. Here is something else Nightingale understood deeply, which is the extraordinary importance of the people you spend your time with. He often said that you cannot escape the influence of your environment, and by environment he meant primarily the people in it. He was not advocating callousness toward others or the abandonment of people you care about, but he was pointing to something undeniably true. The attitudes, expectations, language, and habits of the people around you exert a constant gravitational pull on your own thinking. If you spend most of your time around people who believe life is fundamentally hard, and that success is mostly luck, and that the system is rigged, and that it is not worth trying, you will find it much harder to maintain optimism, not because their view is more accurate than yours, but because human beings are profoundly social creatures who unconsciously absorb the worldview of the people they are close to. Beliefs are contagious. Attitudes spread. The culture of a small group, even just 2 or 3 people, shapes each individual in it in ways that are genuinely hard to resist. Conversely, if you can find your way into the company of people who are curious, engaged, growth-oriented, hopeful about the future, and consistently working toward meaningful goals, that too is contagious. Their energy becomes part of your environment. Their questions prompt you to ask better questions. Their standards raise yours. Their belief that things are possible makes possibility feel more real to you. This is not about finding perfect people or idealized communities. It is about being honest with yourself about which direction the influence flows in your most important relationships and making conscious choices about how you spend your social time. Nightingale was clear that choosing your environment, including your social environment, is one of the most important choices available to you. Most people treat it as though it is fixed, as though the social world they inhabit is simply given rather than chosen. But it is not fixed. It is built through the decisions you make about who you reach out to, who you spend time with, whose company you seek out, and whose influence you allow into your life. Now let us talk about failure, because any honest conversation about optimism has to address failure honestly. Nightingale did not shy away from this, and it is one of the reasons his work has held up so well over time. He did not pretend that optimism makes you immune to failure. He did not suggest that positive thinking prevents difficulty or pain or loss. What he suggested was something far more useful, which is that your relationship with failure, the meaning you make of it and the response you have to it, is entirely within your power to shape. He pointed out that virtually every person who had achieved something meaningful had done so not in spite of failure but largely through it. Failure, understood correctly, is information. It tells you something you did not know before. It reveals a gap between your current capability and the capability required. It shows you an assumption you were making that turned out to be wrong. It points toward an adjustment that needs to be made. None of this is comfortable. All of it is useful. The pessimistic interpretation of failure, the one that says, I tried and failed, therefore I am a failure, therefore I should not try again, cuts off access to all that information. It turns a learning experience into an identity wound, and it forecloses the very process by which improvement happens, because improvement happens through the cycle of attempt, failure, learning, and adjusted attempt. Take out any one of those elements and the cycle breaks. The optimistic interpretation of failure says something completely different. It says this did not work as I expected, which means there is something here for me to learn. What did I discover? What needs to change? What is the next adjusted attempt? This interpretation is not about forcing a smile onto a painful situation. It is about staying in the learning cycle rather than dropping out of it. It is about treating setback as a chapter in the story rather than the end of it. Nightingale was particularly interested in the mental habits of people he called winners, by which he did not mean the rich or the famous, but people who consistently produced results they were proud of and lived with a sense of genuine engagement and meaning. And what he found, consistently, was that these people had a remarkable ability to separate their sense of self from the results of any particular effort. They could fail at a specific thing without feeling like they were fundamentally a failure. They could succeed at something without attributing the success entirely to factors outside themselves. They had what psychologists now call a stable locus of internal control, meaning they saw themselves as genuinely responsible for their outcomes, which made both failure and success things they could learn from, rather than things that simply happened to them. This is deeply important because the alternative, seeing your results as primarily determined by external forces, by luck, by other people, by the economy, by timing, leave you effectively powerless. If your outcomes depend on things outside your control, then there is nothing you can do to meaningfully influence them. You are just waiting to see how things go. And waiting is not a strategy. Taking genuine ownership, not in the sense of blaming yourself for everything that goes wrong, but in the sense of asking what you could do differently and what is within your power to change, is the single most empowering mental shift available to a human being. It is uncomfortable because it means you cannot use external circumstances as a complete excuse, but it is also liberating because it means your outcomes are not entirely fixed by forces beyond your reach. Let us pause here and think about this more personally for a moment. Think about an area of your life that has not been going the way you want it to. Maybe it is your finances, or your health, or a relationship, or your career, or the progress on a creative project. And ask yourself honestly, what story have you been telling about why it is the way it is? Is the story primarily about things outside you, about other people, about circumstances, about bad luck? Or does the story include a clear-eyed assessment of choices you have made and actions you have or have not taken? Most honest assessments will find both. External factors are real. Circumstances matter. Some people do have advantages, others do not, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of distortion. But within whatever external reality you are facing, there is almost always more room for agency than the pessimistic story allows for. There is almost always something you could do differently, something you could try, some new information you could seek, some resource you have not yet explored. And recognizing that, genuinely claiming that space of agency, is what the optimistic orientation does at its best. Nightingale spent a lot of time on the question of how to maintain this orientation, because he understood that it is easier to hold in theory than in practice. Life applies pressure. Hard days happen. Things go wrong in ways that feel unfair, because sometimes they genuinely are unfair. The pessimistic interpretation of those moments is always available, always ready with a convincing case. How do you stay on the other side of it? His answer had several components. First, he talked about the importance of what you feed your mind. He was an early, enthusiastic proponent of what is now sometimes called a media diet, which is the idea that what you regularly read, watch, listen to, and expose yourself to shapes your thinking in ways you might not consciously notice. He pointed out that the average person's daily mental diet consisted mostly of news designed to alarm them, entertainment designed to distract them, and conversation that rarely rose above complaint. None of that is nourishing. None of it builds the mental muscles of optimism and agency. He advocated strongly for spending a portion of every day reading something that educated, inspired, or genuinely challenged you, not as a luxury but as a maintenance practice for your most important asset, which is the quality of your thinking. He read voraciously throughout his life and attributed much of his development to the books he encountered. He said once that a man who does not read is no better off than a man who cannot read. The potential is there, but unused. Second, he talked about the power of solitude and deliberate thinking. He observed that most people are desperately afraid of silence. They fill every quiet moment with noise, with the radio, with television, with constant conversation, because silence forces them to confront their own thinking, and their own thinking often makes them uncomfortable. But the discomfort of encountering your own unexamined thoughts is not a reason to avoid it. It is a reason to face it, because those unexamined thoughts are running your life whether you look at them or not. Nightingale recommended making time every day, even just 20 or 30 minutes, to sit quietly without distraction and think about your most important goal. To hold it in mind, to turn it over, to ask what the next step might be, to notice what fears arise around it and examine them honestly. He called this your thinking time, and he treated it as non-negotiable, not optional, not a reward for completing other tasks, but a daily practice as essential as eating or sleeping. The extraordinary thing about this practice is that the mind, given space and a clear question, will almost always generate something useful. Ideas surface, connections form. Solutions appear that were not visible when you were busy reacting to everything around you. The mind is genuinely creative when given the conditions for creativity, which primarily means space and focus. Most modern lives provide almost no space and fractured focus. The result is that people go through entire lifetimes with enormous creative and problem-solving potential that never gets properly engaged. Third, Nightingale talked about the power of gratitude, not as a sentimental practice but as a cognitive one. He pointed out that anxiety about the future and gratitude for the present cannot fully coexist. When you are genuinely present to what is good in your life, the fear-based narrative that drives pessimism loses some of its hold, and what he meant by gratitude was not a forced positivity, not pretending everything is wonderful when it is not, but a genuine practice of noticing what is working, what is already present, what resources and relationships and capacities you already have. Because one of the most common cognitive distortions that drives pessimism is the tendency to focus on what is absent while being almost entirely blind to what is present. We are wired, evolutionarily, to notice threats and deficits before we notice abundance and safety. That wiring was useful when we were running from predators, but it is not useful when we are trying to build a meaningful modern life. It causes us to systematically undercount our resources and overcount our obstacles. Deliberately attending to what is good does not fix all your problems, but it does give you a more accurate picture of the actual territory you are navigating, and a more accurate picture is always better than a distorted one. Fourth, he talked about the importance of action, not frenzied, unfocused activity, but the specific and regular taking of steps toward your most important goal. Because optimism, for all its cognitive components, ultimately has to translate into behavior to mean anything. And behavior, even small behavior, generates feedback. It tells you whether you are on the right track. It creates the experience of competence that grows confidence. It produces results that feed further motivation. The person who is waiting to feel confident before they act has the causality entirely backwards. Confidence comes from action, not before it. This is something people get wrong so often it is worth dwelling on. The feeling of readiness, the sense that you are prepared enough and capable enough to take the next step, almost never arrives before the step. It arrives during the step or after it. The courage required is not the absence of fear. It is taking the next step while the fear is present. And optimism is what makes that possible. Optimism does not eliminate the fear. It just makes the step feel worth taking anyway. Let us move now into the realm of work and vocation, because Nightingale had a great deal to say about this, and it resonates with something deeply important about how most people are living. He was troubled, genuinely troubled, by the number of people he encountered who hated their work, who lived for the weekend, who counted down the days to retirement, who spent the majority of their waking hours doing something that bored or frustrated or depleted them. He felt this was not only sad on a personal level, but wasteful on a civilizational one. He believed and argued for this with great consistency, that human beings are designed to do work they care about, not necessarily work that is glamorous or highly paid, but work that they find genuinely engaging, that exercises their real capabilities, that connects to something they value. He was convinced that when people are doing work that genuinely fits them, they perform at a dramatically higher level and live at a dramatically higher level of well-being. And he believed the inverse was also true, that working for years or decades at something you find meaningless is genuinely corrosive to the human spirit. Now this raises an obvious and important question. What do you do if you are not doing work you find meaningful? What if circumstances have brought you to a job that does not engage you, and walking away from it is not financially feasible? Nightingale's answer was practical and compassionate. He did not say, quit your job and follow your passion. He said, start where you are. Use what you have. Build toward what you want. Specifically, he advocated for a dual approach. First, bring the very best of yourself to whatever work you are currently doing, not because the work deserves your excellence, but because the habit of excellence, once built, transfers. The person who does mediocre work because they do not respect the job, is also building the habit of mediocrity. The person who does excellent work because that is who they have decided to be, regardless of external recognition or reward, is building something that will serve them well in every subsequent context. Second, alongside that, he advocated for intentional investment in your own development and in the pursuit of work that fits you better. This might mean studying at night. It might mean building skills on weekends. It might mean having conversations, exploring options, researching possibilities. It will almost certainly require patience because the path from where you are to where you want to be is rarely short or straight. But the path exists, and the person who walks it, even slowly, gets farther than the person who stands still waiting for the path to come to them. He also said something about attitude toward current work that is worth sitting with. He said that your attitude toward your current situation will largely determine how quickly and completely you transition to a better one. Employers, clients, collaborators, mentors, they are all paying close attention, consciously or not, to how you show up to whatever you are doing. The person who shows up fully engaged, creative, committed, and reliable, regardless of the level of the work, will consistently attract better opportunities than the person who shows up resentfully doing the minimum. Because the qualities that make someone valuable in one context make them recognizable as valuable in every context. Excellence has a visibility to it, and so does the opposite. This is connected to something Nightingale called service. He believed deeply and argued this point with considerable force, that the most reliable path to success in any economic sense is through genuine high-quality service to other people, not in a servile or self-denying way, but in the sense of identifying what other people genuinely need and providing it better than anyone else is providing it. He pointed out that the businesses, professionals, and individuals who consistently thrive are the ones who are genuinely focused on the people they are serving, who think constantly about how to improve the value of what they offer, who are driven by the question of how to make things better for the people on the other end of their work. The people who struggle are often those who are primarily focused on what they can get rather than what they can give. And this is not a moral judgment so much as a practical observation. The market, in any form, responds to value, and value is defined by the people you are serving, not by you. The businesses that fail, the careers that stagnate, the projects that go nowhere are often characterized by a primary focus on the self-interest of the person doing the work, rather than the genuine interest and benefit of the people being served. Optimism plays a role here too, because it is the optimistic person, the person who genuinely believes that things could be better, who keeps asking how to improve the service they offer. The pessimist decides it is good enough and stops trying. The optimist knows that good enough today is behind the curve tomorrow and keeps searching for better. Nightingale had what might be called an almost reverent respect for the human capacity to grow. He was genuinely excited by the idea that a person could, at any point in their life, decide to become more than they currently are, not through some external transformation, but through the internal work of learning, practicing, refining, and applying. He often used the metaphor of an acorn and an oak tree, pointing out that everything the oak tree needs to become what it is was already present inside the acorn. The potential was always there. What was required was the right conditions, the right soil, the right water, the right light, and the time to grow. People are the same in his view. The potential is already present. What is needed are the right conditions, and to a remarkable degree, you have the ability to create those conditions for yourself through your choices. The books you read, the time you give to deliberate thinking and practice, the relationships you cultivate, the goals you set and pursue, these are all conditions. And you are the gardener. He had a specific belief about what separates people who grow from people who do not, and it comes down to a single quality, the willingness to do what most people are not willing to do. Not in a heroic, dramatic sense, in the most ordinary sense imaginable, the willingness to read when others are watching television, the willingness to think carefully when others are reacting impulsively, the willingness to invest in your development when others are spending on short-term comfort, the willingness to keep going when others have stopped. These are not dramatic or extraordinary choices, but they compound. Over months and years, they compound into an extraordinary difference. He sometimes called this the price of success, and he meant it literally. Success in any domain has a price, paid not in money but in time, effort, discomfort, and discipline. And unlike most prices, this one is paid in advance before the results arrive, which is what makes it difficult. You put in the effort and the patience and the consistency before you see any evidence that it is working. You keep going through the doubt and the discouragement and the moments when it looks like nothing is changing. And then, usually not all at once but gradually, and then suddenly, the results begin to appear, and they look, from the outside, like overnight success. From the inside, they look like years of quietly doing the work. Nightingale was also deeply interested in the subject of money, not as an end in itself, but as a reflection of value created and service rendered. He rejected the idea that wanting financial security was somehow ignoble or shallow. He argued that financial stress is one of the greatest obstacles to the kind of clear, expansive, creative thinking that produces a good life. Brett. So building financial security is not a concession to materialism. It is the creation of a foundation on which everything else you care about becomes more possible. What he objected to was the idea that money was an end in itself, something to be accumulated beyond any rational need simply for the feeling of having it. He observed that people who organized their lives entirely around the acquisition of money, to the exclusion of relationships, health, meaning, and contribution, tended to end up with the money and without the life. And he felt that was a peculiarly sad outcome, given that the point of financial security is to make life better, not to become the purpose of life itself. His view of money was essentially this: focus on the value you are creating, on the service you are rendering, on becoming genuinely excellent at something people genuinely need, and the financial reward for that will follow in proportion. Not magically, and not always immediately, but reliably over time. And the person who is focused on service rather than extraction tends to keep growing, keep improving, keep finding ways to provide more value, which in turn creates more return. It is a self-reinforcing cycle that runs in exactly the opposite direction from the cycle of someone who is focused primarily on getting rather than giving. Let us talk now about something that is less commonly discussed in the context of personal development, but that Nightingale touched on frequently, which is the relationship between optimism and physical health. He was ahead of his time in recognizing what research now consistently demonstrates, that your mental state has profound effects on your physical well-being, and that your physical habits, in turn, have profound effects on your mental state. He observed that the people who seemed to sustain their energy and enthusiasm most effectively over long periods were almost universally people who took care of their bodies. Not obsessively, not as a performance of discipline, but consistently. They slept enough, they moved regularly, they ate in ways that sustained their energy rather than sapping it. They recognize that the mind does not operate in isolation from the body it lives in, and that neglecting the body is not a neutral act. It is a choice that makes every other aspiration harder to achieve. The optimistic person, he argued, takes care of their physical self not out of vanity, but out of genuine respect for the instrument they have been given to work with. Your energy is the resource through which everything you want to accomplish will have to flow. If that resource is chronically depleted, if you are perpetually tired, foggy, or run down, all the right goals and all the right ideas and all the right intentions in the world will not translate into effective action. Energy is not separate from optimism. In many ways, it is the physical expression of it. He also talked about the relationship between physical movement and mental clarity. The practice of regular exercise was something he advocated not primarily for aesthetic reasons but for cognitive ones. He noted that his clearest and most creative thinking often came during or after physical activity, something that neuroscience has since thoroughly validated. Movement changes the chemistry of the brain in ways that support clearer thinking, better mood regulation, and more effective problem solving. This is not a minor side note. It is a practical tool for maintaining the mental posture of optimism that everything else depends on. Sleep was another thing he discussed with a seriousness that was not common in his era. He pushed back against the cultural celebration of working long hours at the expense of sleep, pointing out that chronic sleep deprivation is one of the most reliable ways to undermine your own judgment, your emotional regulation, your creativity, and your overall effectiveness. The person who is chronically underslept is not hustling their way to success. They are degrading the very faculties they need to succeed. Getting adequate sleep is not laziness. It is intelligent maintenance of your primary tool. Now here is something that does not always get brought up in conversations about Nightingale's work, but that was genuinely central to his thinking. which is his view on the role of adversity. He had a way of looking at difficulty that I find both challenging and deeply useful. He believed, and argued this consistently, that adversity is not an interruption of the good life but a component of it. That struggle, faced with the right mindset, does not diminish you but develops you. That the most important qualities of character, patience, resilience, creativity, empathy, persistence, are almost exclusively developed through difficulty. He pointed to the lives of people he most admired, people who had made genuine contributions and lived with genuine depth, and noted almost without exception that these were not people who had sailed through life on smooth water. They were people who had faced serious obstacles and had responded to those obstacles in a particular way, not by giving up, not by becoming bitter, but by staying engaged, staying curious, and finding in the difficulty something that made them stronger or more capable or more understanding. This is not a call to seek out suffering or to romanticize hardship. It is simply an honest recognition that life will bring difficulty regardless of your preferences, and that the question of how you meet it is entirely within your power. You do not choose whether adversity arrives. You do choose what you do with it when it does, and the choice to find something useful in it, to ask what it is teaching you, to treat it as a test of character rather than evidence of your failure, that is the optimistic response. And the optimistic response, practiced consistently, is what eventually produces a life that looks genuinely remarkable. He used to say something that has stayed with me through every version of this material I have encountered. He said that a man can tell you more about himself by his response to adversity than he could tell you about himself in 10 years of smooth sailing. And this is true. Difficulty is a revealer. It shows you what you actually believe about yourself and the world. It shows you whether your values are real or merely aspirational. It shows you whether your optimism is deep and genuine or just a pleasant feeling that evaporates under pressure. And if you find, in a moment of genuine difficulty, that your optimism evaporates, that is valuable information too. Not as a reason for shame, but as a pointer toward where the real work still needs to be done. At around this point, if you have been listening for a while, you might be wondering how all of this applies in practice, not in theory, not in the abstract, but in the actual texture of your actual life. Because the ideas are compelling in the listening, but the real test is what you do on a Tuesday morning when nothing is going right and you cannot remember why you started, and you are not sure the effort is worth it. Nightingale would say this: on that Tuesday morning, the practice of optimism looks less like a feeling and more like a decision to pick the goal back up, a decision to take the next small step regardless of the mood you are in, a decision to ask a useful question, the what is my best next step question, rather than the defeating one. It is not glamorous. It is not the stuff of inspirational speeches. It is just the quiet, unglamorous choice to keep going. And it is exactly that choice, repeated across hundreds of such mornings, that produces an extraordinary life. Before we continue, if you are finding value in this content, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. Every subscription and every like genuinely helps this channel reach more people who might benefit from these ideas, and it helps the channel to grow so we can keep bringing you this kind of content. It really does make a difference, and your support is deeply appreciated. Now let us go deeper into something Nightingale wrote about that I think deserves much more attention than it typically gets, which is the question of conformity and the courage to think for yourself. Because Nightingale believed, and this was somewhat countercultural even in his time, that one of the greatest obstacles to a meaningful life is the unconscious acceptance of conventional wisdom about what is possible and what you should want and who you are allowed to be. He observed that most people do not have their own goals. They have borrowed goals, absorbed from the culture around them, from their families, from their social group, from advertising and media, without ever stopping to ask whether those goals actually fit the life they want to live. They want the things they have been told to want. They pursue the paths that have been laid out for them. And then they arrive, sometimes decades later, at the destination everyone agreed they should aim for, and find that it is not quite what they expected. Or worse, they do not arrive at all, and find themselves looking back at a life that felt like someone else's. Nightingale was adamant that thinking for yourself, genuinely examining what you value and what you want and what kind of life actually fits you as an individual, is not self-indulgence. It is a moral responsibility. You have been given one life. One. Spending it on someone else's definition of success would be, in his view, a genuine tragedy. Not a dramatic tragedy, a quiet one. The tragedy of potential lived at half its depth. He also talked about the social pressure that makes original thinking difficult. Because when you decide to pursue something unconventional, when you decide to organize your life around values that do not match the mainstream, you will encounter resistance. From people who care about you and are worried. From people who do not care about you and feel threatened. From the general weight of a culture that prefers conformity to originality. And the temptation, when you encounter that resistance, is to doubt yourself. To wonder if the unconventional path is actually wrong. To retreat to safety. Optimism is what makes it possible to hold your own direction in the face of that pressure. Not arrogance, not the dismissal of all external input, but the grounded confidence to take the input seriously and then still make your own decision. To hear the concern and say, I hear you. I have thought about this carefully, and this is the direction I am choosing. That groundedness, that ability to be genuinely open to outside perspective without being controlled by it, is one of the most valuable things a person can develop. He talked about mentors, too, with great warmth. He believed that finding people who had already done what you wanted to do and learning from them as directly as possible was one of the highest leverage investments available. Not to copy them exactly, because your path will not be identical to anyone else's, but to learn from their experience, to avoid repeating their mistakes, to understand the principles behind their success and apply those principles in your own way. What he noticed was that successful people are almost universally willing to share what they have learned, far more willing than most people expect, because most people never ask. Most people assume that accomplished individuals do not have time for them, or that their request would be presumptuous, or that the answer would not really be available. And so they do not ask, and they miss years of learning that could have been available to them for the price of a conversation. He was also thoughtful about the distinction between learning from experience and learning from the experience of others. Both are valuable, but there are categories of mistake that are simply too costly to learn from firsthand. The person who has already spent 20 years learning what does not work in a particular domain has something precious to offer you. The question is whether you will actually seek it out and listen carefully when you find it. Now there is something in Nightingale's thinking that I want to bring forward very explicitly, because it is easy to miss if you're reading quickly, and it is arguably the most important point of everything we have covered. It is this: all of these ideas, the power of attitude, the importance of goals, the value of deliberate thinking, the practice of gratitude, the discipline of optimism, none of them work as isolated techniques. They work as an integrated way of being in the world. They work when they are not occasional strategies you deploy in hard moments, but the actual character of how you habitually engage with your life. Character, in this sense, is not something you are born with or without. It is something you build, one decision at a time, across the hours and days and years of your actual living. Every time you choose the optimistic interpretation when the pessimistic one is available, every time you ask the useful question rather than the defeating one, every time you take the next step rather than waiting for certainty, every time you invest in your growth rather than settling for comfort, every time you serve with genuine care rather than extracting with minimal effort, you are building the character of a person who produces a meaningful life, and over time that character becomes automatic. It becomes who you are rather than what you are trying to do. And when it becomes who you are, it produces results that are genuinely remarkable. Nightingale was also very interested in the topic of time, because he recognized that time is the most finite resource any person has and the one most commonly squandered. Not through obvious laziness, but through the quiet accumulation of unconsidered moments. The time spent in idle consumption that produces nothing. The time lost to worry about things outside your control. The time given to conversations that go nowhere and activities that add nothing. He was not advocating for a joyless, productivity-obsessed existence where every moment is ruthlessly optimized. He was advocating for consciousness, for awareness of how you are spending the one thing you absolutely cannot get more of. He often challenged people to spend 1 week tracking how they actually spent their time, in detail, hour by hour, and then to compare that honest accounting with how they said they wanted their life to look. In almost every case, there was a dramatic mismatch. People who said they wanted to write were not writing. People who said they wanted to learn a new skill were not practicing it. People who said they valued relationships were spending hours every evening in front of a screen rather than with the people they loved. The life as described and the life as actually lived were often almost unrecognizable as the same life. This is not meant to produce guilt. It is meant to produce clarity, because with clarity comes choice. Once you can see honestly how your time is flowing, you can redirect it. You can look at the gap between your stated values and your actual behavior and make specific, concrete decisions about how to close it, not all at once, not through willpower alone, but through the design of your environment and your habits in ways that make the behavior you want easier and the behavior you do not want harder. Habits were something Nightingale wrote about with considerable sophistication, recognizing that the vast majority of human behavior is automatic rather than deliberate. The question is not whether you will have habits. You will. The question is whether your habits will be working for you or against you. And the answer to that question is largely determined by whether you have ever consciously designed them or simply let them accumulate by default. The default habit, in almost any domain, is not optimized for your well-being or your development or your goals. It is optimized for minimal, immediate discomfort. The default habit is to check your phone the moment you wake up, to eat what is convenient rather than what sustains you, to reach for entertainment before you reach for challenge, to avoid the hard conversation, the difficult task, the uncomfortable possibility. These defaults are not moral failings. They are the natural result of a brain designed to conserve energy and avoid pain. But they are not what you want running your life if you have actual aspirations. Designing better habits is a process that Nightingale described simply as identifying the behavior you want to make automatic, then repeating it consistently in the same context until it no longer requires conscious effort. The first weeks are the hardest. The behavior feels foreign. The friction is high. The old habit pulls at you constantly. But if you can maintain the new behavior through that initial period of resistance, something shifts. The new behavior starts to feel more natural. The old pull weakens. Eventually, the new behavior becomes the default, and you have changed your life in that small but significant domain. And then you move to the next one. He was realistic about the time this takes. He talked about research suggesting that a new habit, depending on its complexity and how deeply the old habit was ingrained, can take anywhere from a few weeks to several months to fully establish. The person who tries to change everything at once, who commits to a complete lifestyle overhaul beginning Monday, almost always reverts within days because the cognitive and willpower demands are simply too high. The person who picks one thing, focuses on it, and waits until it is genuinely automatic before adding the next thing, that person makes real and lasting progress. This is the optimistic approach to change, paradoxically, not the dramatic all-or-nothing commitment that feels exciting but does not hold, the patient, incremental, sustainable approach that actually works, the one that treats personal development as a long game, because it is a long game, and the long game, played consistently, produces results that no short game ever will. Let us talk about one more dimension of Nightingale's thinking that I find particularly profound, and that is his view of what he called the invisible power of the mind. He was not speaking mystically when he used language like this. He was pointing to something genuinely remarkable about the human capacity for creativity and problem solving, which is that it operates in ways that are largely outside conscious awareness. He observed that some of the best solutions to difficult problems arrive not when you are sitting at your desk straining to think them through, but when you have stepped away, gone for a walk, slept on it, or engaged in some unrelated activity. The mind, when given a clear question and then released from the pressure of forced thinking, continues working on the problem below the level of conscious attention, and then delivers the result at unexpected moments. This is what many people call intuition or inspiration, and Nightingale believed it was not mysterious at all. It was the natural result of a well-fed, well-directed, well-rested mind doing what minds do, which is connect things and find patterns and generate solutions. The practical implication of this is important. When you are facing a genuinely difficult problem, the worst thing you can do is sit and strain at it for hours. The best thing you can do is define the problem clearly. Feed your mind with relevant information, think about it deliberately for a period, and then deliberately step away and let the deeper processes work. And then, critically, when an idea arrives, even a partial or imperfect one, write it down immediately, because the products of this deeper processing are often fleeting. They surface briefly and then disappear. The notebook, the voice memo, the quick written note, these are the tools through which intuitive insight becomes actionable. He also talked about the value of asking better questions, because he understood that the mind is essentially a question-answering machine. It will work on whatever question you put to it with great diligence. But if you are asking the wrong questions, the answers it provides, even if technically correct, will not move you toward what you want. The person who asks, "Why does this always happen to me?" will get answers. The mind will supply reasons, historical evidence, patterns that confirm the story of victimhood. The person who asks, "What can I do about this?" will also get answers. Different answers. Answers that point toward agency and action. The question you ask shapes the answer you receive, and the answers you receive shape the actions you take. So asking better questions is not a soft or abstract practice. It is one of the most concretely useful things you can do. Nightingale would often suggest replacing the question, "What is wrong with this?" with the question, "What is right about this, and how can I build on it?" Not as a way of ignoring what is wrong, but as a way of ensuring that the problem does not consume all the available attention, because problems, attended to exclusively, have a way of growing in the imagination while solutions shrink. Attending to what is working, even in the midst of what is not, keeps the solution space open and accessible. He also suggested replacing the question, "Can I do this?" with the question, "How can I do this?" Because the first question invites a yes or no answer, and the mind, if it is not already confident, will often answer no. The second question assumes the answer is yes and asks only for the method. It keeps the door open. It directs the mind toward solution rather than evaluation, and the mind directed toward solution is remarkably good at finding one. There is a story I want to share here that captures something essential about everything we have been discussing. A young man in his early 20s was working in a small town at a job that bored him thoroughly. He had grown up in circumstances that were not easy, without much money, without strong educational support, without obvious advantages, but he had, somehow, gotten hold of a belief that things could be different. He did not know exactly how, but he believed they could be. So he started reading, not randomly, but with intention. He read about people who had built things he admired and tried to understand how they had done it. He took notes. He asked questions. He found people in his community who were doing interesting work and asked if he could buy them a cup of coffee and hear their story. Most of them said yes. He was not networking in any calculated sense. He was genuinely curious and genuinely willing to learn. He kept his job because he needed it. But he gave his best hours, the early morning hours before work and the evening hours after, to developing himself. He read, he practiced, he wrote things down. He thought carefully about what he wanted and revised his thinking as he learned more. He failed at several things. Some of his early efforts produced nothing useful. He felt discouraged more times than he could count. But he kept going, not because he was certain it would work. He was not certain, but because stopping felt like a worse option than continuing. Because he had developed, through all those hours of reading and thinking and trying, a genuine belief that the next step was worth taking, and then the next one, and the next one. Years later, he was doing work he loved, surrounded by people who challenged and inspired him, building something that mattered to him and to the people it served. He had not gotten lucky, at least not in any disproportionate sense. He had simply kept going, with intelligence and intention, longer than most people around him were willing to. He had made the choice, over and over, to be the kind of person who learns, rather than the kind of person who waits. That story is not remarkable because it is unusual. It is remarkable because it is so replicable. The same sequence, the clear intention, the consistent investment, the willingness to fail and keep going, the patient compounding of small efforts over a long time, is available to almost anyone willing to actually do it. The distance between where most people are and where they could be is not talent or luck or circumstances. It is primarily a question of whether they are willing to engage fully, consistently over time, with the extraordinary life that is waiting for them just beyond the edge of their comfort zone. Nightingale believed this with every part of himself. He had lived it. He had watched hundreds of others live it, and he spent his entire career trying to share what he had seen, not as a theoretical possibility, but as a practical, demonstrated, repeatable reality. Let us move into the final dimensions of his thinking now, the parts that tie everything together and give it a shape that you can carry with you, because information without integration is just interesting noise. And the goal here is not that you know more. The goal is that you think differently and then live differently. One of the central themes running through all of Nightingale's work is what he described as the abundance of opportunity. He lived in a time when America was going through extraordinary economic change, when the post-war period was producing a kind of opportunity that his parents' generation had never imagined. But he made an important distinction. He said that opportunity is not the same as luck. Luck is random. Opportunity is available to anyone who is prepared to recognize and act on it. And preparation, of course, is the product of everything we have been talking about. He often pointed out that most people walk past opportunity every single day, not because it is hidden, but because they are not looking for it. They are too busy looking at what is wrong, at what is not there, at what they do not have. The person who is conditioned to look for possibility, by contrast, finds it constantly. Not because the world is providing them with more of it, but because their attention is calibrated to detect it. The same external world produces dramatically different experiences depending on what you are programmed to notice. This is one of the most actionable implications of everything Nightingale taught. The practice of actively looking for opportunity, of asking in every situation, even difficult ones, what is possible here that I might be missing, is something you can do starting today, not tomorrow, not when conditions improve, but today, in the circumstances you are actually in. And if you do it consistently, even when it feels forced and artificial, it will gradually become natural. And when it becomes natural, your experience of the world shifts in ways that are genuinely and lastingly transformative. He also wrote about the importance of what he called going the extra mile, a concept he borrowed from Napoleon Hill and made his own. The idea is disarmingly simple. Do more than is expected of you, more than is required of you, more than most people around you are doing, and do it not for immediate reward, but as a consistent practice. The person who consistently goes beyond what is expected becomes indispensable. They become the person others think of when something important needs to be done. They become the person who gets the opportunity when an opportunity arrives, not because they were lucky, but because they had made themselves the obvious choice through years of consistent effort. This runs counter to the transactional way most people approach their work. Most people give roughly as much as they are being paid for and not much more, which is understandable but limiting, because the level at which you are currently being compensated reflects what you have already demonstrated. The level at which you could be compensated reflects what you are capable of. And the only way to demonstrate capability beyond what is currently expected of you is to give beyond what is currently expected of you. It is a form of investment. You are investing effort in advance of the return, and like all investments, it requires patience. The return does not arrive immediately. Sometimes it takes longer than feels fair. But it almost always arrives, because people and organizations consistently seek out and reward those who consistently produce beyond expectation. It is one of the most reliable dynamics in any economy. Nightingale was very clear that this principle applies in every domain of life, not just professional ones. In relationships, the person who consistently gives more care, more attention, more thoughtfulness than is strictly required creates something qualitatively different from the person who is always calculating what is owed. In health, the person who consistently does a little more than they feel like doing, who chooses the better option when the easier one is available, builds a quality of physical well-being that is genuinely superior. In intellectual development, the person who consistently reads and thinks and questions a little more than is comfortable builds a quality of understanding that produces better decisions and more creative problem-solving. The extra mile is not a metaphor for dramatic effort. It is a description of the consistent, modest daily practice of giving just a little more than you absolutely have to. And over time, that modest daily practice produces a life that is anything but modest. Let us also talk about what Nightingale called the attitude of the successful, because he did extensive observation of people he considered successful in the deepest sense, and he found consistent patterns that went beyond the specifics of their work or their industry or their background. These patterns were attitudinal. They were the way these people mentally and emotionally showed up to their lives. The first was a quality of expectation. Not arrogant entitlement, but a calm, grounded expectation that things would work out, not necessarily easily or without difficulty, but ultimately in their favor if they kept at it. This expectation was not passive, it was active. It was the expectation that their effort would produce something, that their investment would yield returns, that the challenges they faced were solvable. And this expectation shaped their behavior in ways that made it self-fulfilling. They persisted longer, they tried more creative approaches, they maintained stronger relationships, all because their basic orientation was that persistence and creativity and relationship building would produce results. The second pattern was a quality of gratitude and appreciation that went beyond mere politeness. These were people who seemed genuinely moved by the good things in their lives, who noticed beauty and connection and small moments of grace that other people walked past. Nightingale believed this was not a personality trait but a practice, something that had been cultivated through years of deliberate attention, and he believed it was worth cultivating because it both made life more genuinely enjoyable and also, functionally, produced better thinking by keeping the mind in a state of openness and receptivity rather than contraction and defense. The third pattern was a quality of focus. These people knew what they were working toward, and they kept coming back to it, even when distracted, even when other attractive things competed for their attention. They had developed the capacity to say no to good things in the service of great things, to recognize that every yes is also a no to everything else that moment could have been used for, and to make those trade-offs deliberately and consistently. The fourth pattern was what he called the love of learning. These were people who never stopped being curious, never decided they had learned enough, never reached a point of sufficient knowledge where they stopped seeking more. They read constantly, asked questions constantly, sought out new experiences and ideas constantly, not because they were incomplete, but because they were alive to the fact that the world is inexhaustible and that there is always more to understand, more to know, more to explore. And the fifth pattern, perhaps the most foundational, was what he described as a deep sense of personal responsibility. Not the crushing weight of blame, but the empowering conviction that they were the primary agents of their own outcomes. That while circumstances mattered, their response to circumstances mattered more. That the deck might be stacked against them in some ways, but that this did not decide the game. That they could, through deliberate effort and intelligent choices, produce a life worth living regardless of what they had been given at the start. This is where we come full circle, because this sense of personal responsibility is, in the end, the most fundamental expression of optimism. It is the belief that your actions matter, that the choices you make today will produce outcomes tomorrow, that the effort you put in is connected to something real, that the world is not indifferent to your engagement but responsive to it, that you are not a passive recipient of whatever life happens to send your way, but an active participant in the co-creation of your own experience. That belief, held consistently and acted on daily, is what turns the ideas in these pages from interesting thoughts into actual lives, not perfect lives, not lives without difficulty or pain or loss or failure, but lives lived with genuine engagement, genuine growth, genuine contribution, and genuine meaning. And that, ultimately, is what Nightingale was pointing toward through all his years of writing and speaking and teaching. He did not promise an easy path. He promised a real one. He promised that if you were willing to think clearly, act consistently, serve genuinely, and persist patiently, you would build something that most people only dream about. Not because you were special, in some innate way that others are not, but because you were willing to do what most people are not willing to do. Because you chose, day after day, to engage fully with the extraordinary life that was available to you. That is the message at the heart of everything Earl Nightingale ever wrote. The world responds to you. Your thinking shapes your life. Your attitude is your most powerful tool. And you have the ability, starting wherever you are, to aim that tool in any direction you choose. The question is not whether you can, the question is whether you will. And if you have listened this far, if you have stayed with these ideas through everything we have covered, then some part of you already knows the answer. Start where you are. Use what you have. Do what you can. Think bigger than your current circumstances. Serve better than the minimum. Persist longer than most. And watch what that simple, unglamorous, extraordinary practice does to your one and only life. The path forward is not hidden. It is not complicated. It is simply taken, one step at a time, with a mind pointed in the right direction and a heart genuinely committed to the journey. The journey, as Nightingale would tell you, is everything. Not just the destination, not just the result, but the daily experience of being fully engaged with the life you are building, of being curious and growing and contributing and choosing every single day to be a little more than you were yesterday. That is the smile Nightingale was talking about, not a performance of happiness, not a forced optimism that papers over reality. but the deep, settled, earned satisfaction of a life fully lived, a mind fully used, and a contribution genuinely made. The smile that comes from knowing, at the end of the day, that you showed up, that you tried, that you gave something real to the world and to the people in it, that you took the extraordinary potential you were born with and did not leave it unused. That is what he wanted for you. That is what these essays were reaching toward. And that is what, if you take even a fraction of this to heart and put it into practice, is waiting for you on the other side of the next decision you make. Go build it. Go think clearly. Go serve well. Go persist patiently. Go live fully. The world is waiting for what you are capable of, and it has been waiting quietly for this exact moment when you decide to begin. If these ideas have resonated with you today, please take a moment to give this video a like and subscribe to Audiobook Library. Your support genuinely helps this channel reach more people who could benefit from content like this, and it allows us to keep creating these kinds of deep, meaningful summaries for you. Every like, every subscription, every comment you leave really does make a difference and helps the channel grow. We are deeply grateful for each one of you who has chosen to spend this time here. And please do have a look through the rest of our video library. We have covered so many extraordinary books and ideas across philosophy, personal development, success literature, and some of the most influential thinkers in history. There is so much more waiting for you there, and we would love for you to explore it. Thank you, from all of us at Audiobook Library, for listening. See you in the next one.